I was listening to Professor John Mearsheimer before Trump signed the surrender document at Versailles, aka the Memorandum of Misunderstanding. At that time, Mearsheimer said the reason Trump was compelled to sign the surrender document is because he was being told by his advisors that the world is facing a economic precipice. And if the war were to continue, especially if the war were continued to the end of July, then we are economic world depression is baked in. And that's why Trump had said publicly he does not want to be a Herbert Hoover. He does not want to be the US president that brings the world to an economic depression. And yeah, here we are. We are now at the end of July, and the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. So, what are the prospects right now for the world economy?
Oh, well, I think what's interesting to observe firstly is how the global economic structure has adapted over the course of the last 5 months, or not adapted, as the case may be. I think one of the things that we know is that there has been overall a reduction in the use of crude oil and crude oil derivatives. Some of that, of course, has resulted in some problems downstream, shortages of materials, etc., etc. But a lot of that, for the time being, I think, has been largely papered over by being able to draw down on available inventories. The risk is that as those inventories are not being topped up and the shortage of inflow continues to play itself out, that the real supply side crunch is going to come later this year. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is worth noting is China's own response. China is one of the biggest users of crude oil globally, and China itself reduced its pull on the global oil market over the course of the last 5 months, which significantly alleviated pressure on the world market itself, to a point where I think it's fair to say that one of the things we've learned from this conflict is that, firstly, China is not as dependent upon global oil as many people once believed it to be. And secondly, in fact, China, as a big buyer and as a big accumulator of reserves, nonetheless holds a dominant position because it can use that buying power to shape the dynamics of global oil pricing. Now, that's a very fascinating outcome that we've now learned, because prior to the war, people would often talk about swing suppliers as being the price setters, whether it was Saudi Arabia or the United States. But in fact, what we've got is a swing customer that is dictating terms. The fact that China's been able to do this and sustain its broad economic restructuring and ongoing economic growth tells us a lot about the Chinese economy as well. And we might touch on that later on. But globally, I think we've seen some restructuring by way of demand destruction. We have already seen depletion of reserves, and the real issue is not so much what has already happened, but it's whether or not what's been going on in terms of preparations for a potential longer term supply side crunch is going to be able to deal with a tightening supply side, and what that's ultimately going to mean. I think on things that I think are actually really worth watching out for at the moment is the impact of fertilizers on next season's cropping, especially if it intersects with the El Nino effect that is anticipated, which could have a very significant adverse effect on global food production. What's going to happen from that in terms of the cost of food and ultimately the availability of food, particularly to poorer countries. I think that is something that people should be rightly concerned about, because it's not just a case of, well, those poor people over there are going to starve, and there's a moral and humanitarian issue, which is true. But on top of that, when you have these kinds of humanitarian crises, it actually then catalyzes a whole bunch of other things. And the first world countries, of course, actually don't like a whole bunch of these other things happening to them, namely large migration, etc., right? So these effects, of course, can just reverberate through the global economic and social systems for quite some time to come. My own gut feeling, for what it's worth, is that national economies, by and large, and particularly those underpinned by deepening connections to the Chinese economy, will reasonably adapt to a future tightening and a further tightening of global oil. I might be wrong on all of this, by the way, Carl, and we might actually end up with a chronic depression. That wouldn't surprise me either. But I think that the adjustments that many countries can make will be made, and there will be some difficulties in certain sectors, no doubt. Some countries will find it harder than others. A place like Australia, for example, where I'm at, is likely to face greater challenges because of its outsized dependency on imported fuels, for example, and imported fertilizers. Asia, more generally speaking, Japan, Korea, Singapore in particular, are likely to face significant challenges as a result, whereas other places, China, Russia, countries that have much less dependency on oil today, in some respects are going to be able to carry on. The opportunity out of this is actually what the long-term structural adjustment is going to be, as opposed to simply some demand destruction to get through. We're looking at really, I think, a need and a growing body of evidence that suggests that organizations and countries around the world realize that they need to change the structure of their energy systems, and that means electrification. And that's going to be the medium-term consequence of this conflict. So short-term wise, there will be patchy effects. I'm never quite sure what this idea of the global economy necessarily means, because the world's actually quite a patchwork quilt, right? Particularly when it comes to energy structures. Some places will be better off than others. The question is going to be what happens coming out of all of this, and what countries will take advantage of the opportunity to accelerate electrification, to deepen their collaborations with the great electrifier, that the world has, which is China, and transition themselves to a position where over the medium term, they are less dependent upon sources of energy that they themselves don't control. I think that's where they're the things that I think are particularly worth paying attention to.
You mentioned about demand destruction, but the demand destruction can only go so far, right? I mean, China already voluntarily cut back half its oil import, which is about 5.5 million barrels of oil. But as you also mentioned, the world's oil inventory has been drawn down in the past few months of war. United States, for example, has less than a month of crude inventory left. And so there's a lot less of a buffer now than the time when Trump signed that surrender document. And in addition, because Trump's renewed hostility against Iran, that led to Yemeni joining the war, and now they're closing down the Bab al-Mandeb. There's a strait at the mouth of the Red Sea. Whereas while the Strait of Hormuz has been closed, there had been some oil that's coming out of the Persian Gulf, and it's mostly through the Saudi pipeline that goes to the port of Yanbu, where it gets loaded on ships and sailed down the Red Sea to the world market. And it's estimated there's about 4.5 million barrels of oil coming out of the Strait of Yanbu. And there might be another 1 to 2 million barrels of oil that was shipped through the UAE pipeline to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. But now the Iranian drones and missile attacks have effectively shut down Fujairah, the UAE pipeline. And with Yemeni joining the war, they're shutting down the Red Sea. So there goes about 5.5 to 6 million barrels of oil, which is equivalent of what China has already voluntarily cut back. So the slack that the slack and the buffer that the world had before is a lot thinner. So this is what kind of worries me. I mean, like right now, the world oil market is still acting as if everything is still okay. Because I took a peek at the oil price today. It sits around between $80 to $90. Do you think Trump will be able to bring back to his senses to end this war before everything just goes kaput?
Well, ending the war, I think, is probably beyond him for the duration of this year. It doesn't mean that he won't, from time to time, agree to temporary cessations of hostilities, for a number of different reasons. One, because I think for the first time, we've seen in the last couple of weeks a very significant number of American soldiers killed in the Persian Gulf, more so than in the previous 4 months, right, when the numbers were very, very low. So I think that there is a general sensibility amongst the American political elite to the prospects of a lot of dead Americans returning back to the United States in flag draped boxes. That's not the kind of optics that a president is looking for heading into a midterm elections where his party is already really facing a very significant uphill battle. The second one, of course, are some of those economic factors that could lead to attempts to try to moderate the consequences of the war. And I think the third issue goes to the state of the American arsenal itself, right? So you bundle all of those things together and you've got a lot of reasons for an American president to periodically agree to cease hostilities. The reason why I think that there's no ending of the war in the short term is because an end of the war in the short term would require President Trump to accept terms that would be tantamount to an American defeat. And accepting those terms in the lead up to a midterm elections would be a very difficult political thing to do. So there'll be a bunch of time buying along the way, attempts to strong arm Iran to shift the terms of a potential settlement, if in fact there is a long-term intent for there to be a settlement with Iran with the present government intact. And I think that there's still a big question mark about that in terms of whether the American political elite, together with their wider ecosystem of supporters, is committed to that idea itself, right? Or whether they're still committed to the idea of greater Israel without Iran. Let's not forget that Israel's having an election as well. And both the candidates in Israel have made it clear that part of their mission is to get rid of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Okay, so it's actually hard to see how, in all of those circumstances, an American president is going to sign off on a lasting peace deal. The question around the demand destruction, I think, is an interesting one, because I think that there are things that we know, which I touched on earlier, and things that we simply don't know. Things that we know, of course, is the ability for some, let's call it demand destruction and belt tightening. Some of that would have been temporary. Let's just reduce the amount of activity that we do, hold our reserves at a commercial level, and see if we can get through the next month, 2 months, 3 months, or what have you. But at some point in time, that becomes problematic, and temporary demand destruction becomes permanent demand destruction or semi-permanent demand destruction. Once you hit semi-permanent demand destruction, the next set of considerations kick in, which is, well, I've got a bunch of equipment here that is now no longer being utilized. I'll maintain that for a while, obviously, because there's a whole bunch of finance capital tied up in that, with the view that maybe at some point in the future, when things calm down again, I'll be able to revitalize the equipment, kick it off, and get myself up and running again. The problem is that once you start doing that, at some point, there is a big financial pressure as cash flows squeeze and as the overall domestic economy in particular begins to feel the pain of rising prices is, well, I'm just going to have to defer maintenance, and eventually things start to fall apart. So that's a distinct possibility in certain areas. The other thing, of course, is what kinds of substitutions can be made. So if we're not using diesel, for example, how quickly can a particular activity switch to something else? Is there a substitute form of energy or technology or method of doing something that enables us to continue our activity, but without using diesel in this case? And in some areas, you probably say there is. You can move into things like electric drone deliveries for last mile logistics. You might even contemplate moving to electric truck haulage, right, for freight transportation. So there are these sorts of substitutions that I think can begin to take place. Some places will do it quicker than others, right? And I don't know which ones are going to be quicker and which ones are going to be slower. When we look across Asia, for example, we do see reports of an acceleration of not only electrification for passenger motor vehicles, but also the electrification of freight transport. Right? So that's going to continue, and that will accelerate, to 2030, 2035. Is the United States going to move down that pathway as quickly as, Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia? Well, actually, I suspect not. Right, the infrastructure is not there. The electric trucks aren't there, and the United States is actually making it more difficult for American enterprises to get access to this kind of capability than ever before. So the speed at which this substitution can take place, I think, is going to be severely hampered in the United States. So again, the reactions globally are going to be quite patchworky and hard to predict. They'll have ripple effects that will also transform things in ways that are difficult to foresee as well. All I can, in a sense, get a handle on is this first order reaction of substitution, which is the places that are beginning to get their act together on electrifying not just passenger motor vehicles, but ultimately electrifying and moving away from hydrocarbon-based transportation for freight. And that's the big move, right? And even in Australia, little old Australia is starting to see some pilot projects emerge for electric long-haul trucking. China itself has, of course, ramped up the sale and deployment of electric trucks. It is scaling up green hydrogen as dense store of energy for the purposes of freight transportation, whether it's maritime or terrestrial. And I think we're going to see developments in these particular application technologies at rates far faster than any of us anticipated 6 months ago, because the need is so pressing now.
What do you say to people who say there's a deliberate strategy in United States waging this war and closing down the Strait of Hormuz? They say, well, because United States itself is awash in oil, particularly shale oil, so you can't afford to shut down the pipeline of hydrocarbons from Persian Gulf, because the people most affected will be countries in Asia and to some extent in Europe. While United States is okay because US still have access to all the oil that's both produced in the continental United States, but also in Venezuela, which US now controls. So this is a deliberate U.S. strategy to destabilize the world energy supply while itself reaps a benefit of the energy shortage. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's quite clear, in fact, that the United States doesn't reap the benefits. We already see rising costs at the pump. So that's hardly a benefit to the United States, broadly speaking, even if it may be beneficial in the short term to refineries. We also need to understand that oils ain't oils, right? The chemical properties of oils from the Middle East is very different from the chemical properties and the composition of the oils from the shale fields that the United States, of course, depends upon. And that means that the final products that we get at the end of the refining process is different as well. People forget that the United States imports a significant amount of crude oil so that it can manufacture diesel, amongst other things. And in fact, if it wasn't for the importation of crude oils, it wouldn't be exporting some of the products that it exports as well. What tends to happen in these discussions is a level of abstraction about energy that is incredibly misleading. So people talk about the United States being a net exporter of energy, right? Well, only at a certain level of abstraction, but particular kinds of machinery and particular kinds of processes actually use very particular kinds of or forms of energy, which are not substitutes for one another. So the idea that you are at an abstract level a net exporter doesn't help those that depend upon things that can only be made with imported crude. Okay, so if it is a deliberate strategy, the beneficiaries are refiners, but the losers are everyone else who uses downstream products. The other thing that I think it's worth bearing in mind, and I wrote about this some months ago, is that the financial signals that a rising market or rising prices sends would, if they sustain, catalyze further exploration and development of the American shale basins. The problem with that is that whilst that does deliver a financial, or potentially delivers a financial windfall, it actually accelerates the degradation of the systemic energy efficiency of the United States itself. What do I mean by that? Well, every barrel of shale oil that we get out tomorrow takes more energy to get out than it did yesterday. And so all of the easy to extract shale oil has been extracted. The longevity of many of the new bores that have been put in is getting shorter and shorter. Right, so it's more expensive financially, it's more expensive energetically to get that next barrel out, which means that from a system point of view, you're expending more and more energy to get that energy out. This is not actually a desirable outcome from the long-term viability of an economic system. So short-term financial signals undermines long-term economic and energetic viability. So that's your downside risk for the United States. So again, fantastic for those who are in the business of drilling and refining today, but actually not particularly good systemically or for those who are users of downstream refined products. So I don't really buy this idea that this is a deliberate strategy, unless I assume that those who have concocted this particular strategy are not aware of these particular issues, and that's inconceivable. If I'm aware of these issues based on publicly available information, then those people sitting in the Department of Energy, Department of Treasury, in the White House and surrounding the White House must surely also understand these issues as well. So it's either a very poorly conceived strategy, right, or it's a strategy executed in ignorance, one or the other.